Okay, so we are going to finish off chapter 28. So this is part 3. Part 1 was male reproduction, part 2 was female reproduction, and so now we're going to talk about fertilization, pregnancy, and a little bit about lactation, and then we'll talk some about hormonal birth control. Okay, so remember fertilization, we have already covered how ovulation takes place. So the oocyte moves out and into the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, and sperm then were deposited here in the vagina. And so those had to move through the cervix. So during just before ovulation, this thinning of the cervical area takes place. The mucus that usually or that can plug this up thins, and so that's going to allow the sperm to move through. Now the sperm will move through the uterus, and usually fertilization, you need to remember this, fertilization usually takes place in the fallopian tube. Okay. Um, so progesterone promotes a mucus plug that prevents sperm from moving through except for the time prior to ovulation. Okay, so that's going to let it through. Now, when fertilization actually takes place, remember the acrosome of the sperm, it held a bunch of enzymes. So here's a sperm down here that's approaching, and so it will release these enzymes to help sort of break down these cells, these granulosa cells that are surrounding the egg, and also it will help to break down this area called the zona pellucida, which surrounds the oocyte of the egg. And then once that sperm breaks through, it will release its um, chromosomes. So it will release its 23 chromosomes, and whether it's an X or a Y, the 23rd, all of those are released into the egg. But at the same time, it actually causes uh, it depolarizes the cell essentially. Okay, so it causes a reaction that essentially changes the cell membrane, which means that any other sperm, so even though this guy here was very, very close at the same time, as soon as this one breaks through, it depolarizes the whole cell, and then suddenly this sperm will be rejected. It will turn away and it will not penetrate the cell. If more than one sperm penetrate the egg at the same time, then that egg it's not viable, and so that egg will not go on to produce a baby. Okay, so pregnancy. Um, so the oocyte can be fertilized up to 24 hours after ovulation. So once that egg pops out, it's got about 24 hours that it can move through, and it's moving through cilia. Remember what cilia are? They kind of push in that wave-like motion. You're kind of pulling that egg down through the fallopian tube. So we can see in this picture these sperm are kind of traveling up, and they found it way up here. So shortly after ovulation, so they must have been waiting, and so that after fertilization takes place, that egg will continue to move down the fallopian tube, and as it does, there are cells inside the egg that start to divide. So the egg will start to divide. It'll form something around it called a trophoblast. And these cells have no identity. These are what we call undifferentiated or totipotent stem cells. They aren't liver cells, kidney cells, neurons. They're nothing like that. Muscle cells. They have no identity. They're completely undifferentiated. And so what can happen early on is that this thing called a blastocyst, this thing can divide into two. Now remember, it's already fertilized, and all of these cells have all the same DNA in them. So when it divides, it can become two separate babies, essentially, is what's going to happen. So it becomes two separate blastocysts, and they will form two exactly identical babies with the exact same DNA. Okay, so as these cells start to divide, and then they differentiate, and then they become embryo fetus baby. Okay, so that's what we call identical twins, is when this divides, and sometimes just the cells that are inside will sort of move to opposite poles of the what's called the trophoblast. So they'll move to opposite sides, and they'll, like this one might develop over here, and this one, these cells will develop over here, and they're undifferentiated, so they can become anything, and they can become an entire baby. Okay, so that's another way that identical twins can happen. So they can either have their complete separate sacs that they're growing in, or they can grow in together. Um, and sometimes what happens is that maybe these don't separate completely, and then you end up with conjoined twins. Okay, and so that can happen as well. All right, so let's see. So oocyte can be developed, can be fertilized up to 24 hours. Sperm cells are viable for as much as 6 days, usually not quite that much. We like to exaggerate that as much as possible, so we don't make any mistakes. So we want to leave as much leeway as possible. But yeah, the sperm can survive in there a while. Remember, the semen had things that had certain substances in it that would allow it to kind of survive in this environment. Usually it's more like 2 to 4 days. So I have here, this was in your book, ectopic pregnancy is implantation that occurs anywhere other than the uterine cavity. So you might have implantation if that takes place um, in the fallopian tubes, and it's very rare because it really needs that endometrial lining for implantation to take place, but it can sometimes form in other places, and that's called an ectopic pregnancy. All right. Formation of the placenta. So baby and mom have separate circulatory systems. So it's important to remember that. So here's baby. So we could maybe draw the stomach with the umbilical cord, and then maybe get baby a neck and maybe some lips and a nose. Okay, it's starting to look like Beavis and Butthead. Well, anyway, so this is this really, really ugly baby. And so baby has a heart. After a while, this heart will start beating, and so it has its own circulatory system. Well, instead of getting its oxygen from the lung, what it does is it sends its blood out here through this or chorionic sac. Okay, so it's surrounded by the sac. It's called a chorionic sac. And this whole thing together then is called the placenta, with the endometrium and the sac that surrounds it. And so because this baby can't, this very ugly baby, my goodness, can't breathe, it has to get oxygen from somewhere. So what it does, it doesn't share a circulatory system with mom. It just gets It's just like what happens in your lungs. You have a thin layer right here. Mom is releasing some blood and some other fluids down in here. Remember, this endometrium is secretory, so it's secreting various things. In this case, it's nutrients, various amino acids, fats, oxygen. Mom eats for two, mom breathes for two. And so these things kind of cross these membranes, and then the baby can use those. And it goes back to the baby. I drew it in the red, but it's really the blue that's going there, and then it's getting oxygenated, and then it comes back to the baby and gives the baby this oxygen so it can grow. Wow, our baby's getting uglier and uglier. Okay, so the chorion, so we need to remember this. The chorion is a tissue layer that encloses the developing embryo. Okay, so that's what this pink sac is that I'm now making black. That's the chorion. Okay. The amnion is a tissue layer. We can't really see it in this, but the amnion is another layer that kind of surrounds the baby that releases or produces, secretes, there's the word, secretes amniotic fluid, which suspends that embryo. So it gives the baby something to sort of swim around in or float around in. Okay, so we can see, let's see, did I leave anything else out? No, we're going to talk about HCG here. Okay, so development. So what happens during development is that it starts out, and here's our chorion layer here. I'll try to make this in black. Here's our chorion layer around here. So there's the fetus or the embryo that's starting to grow. So the chorion layer is around here, and the baby it starts to form this amniotic sac. I don't know how well you can see this. You can see it better here. The chorion is around here, and then the amniotic sac is also around the baby. Okay, and so it's producing that amniotic fluid. Now, the thing to remember about the chorion is the chorion is producing something called human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, so remember up here in the ovary, So if this is the ovary, remember we had the follicular phase, and then there was ovulation, and then we had this corpus luteum. Well, this corpus luteum wants to know, are we pregnant? Well, this chorionic sac is going to produce a molecule called HCG. Okay? So then this HCG will come back into the ovary, and there are little receptors here, and it says, yes, there is a chorion. If there is a chorion, that means there is a baby that it's surrounding. Okay, so that's the hint. That's how it knows that pregnancy has taken place, because the very sac that surrounds the baby is producing a hormone that then is telling the corpus luteum that yes, you need to stay here. You can't leave until this baby leaves, and that chorion or that corpus luteum will stay there, and it will continue to produce estrogen and progesterone through the duration of the pregnancy. Okay, so we use this HCG. Most pregnancy tests measure human chorionic gonadotropin in urine. Um, it's easier than finding it in the blood, although it's higher in the blood. You can find it more easily in the blood, so blood test is going to be more accurate, but you can also find it in the urine. Okay, so that can be detected about 1 week after implantation, and that chorion starts to grow. Okay, so you have to wait for that chorion to grow before you can actually get a pregnancy test. Okay, so now if we remember, so this is all the stuff we looked at when we were looking at female reproduction. So we saw the FSH and the LH surge, ovulation, and now we're over here in this phase. Okay, and so earlier when we were talking about the reproductive cycle, or the ovarian and uterine cycles, what we saw is this increase in the endometrium, but then if no implantation takes place, okay, so there is no fertilization, no implantation, then these levels will start to fall and the corpus luteum goes away. So what we see in pregnancy is, like I said, the HCG, usually we use a small h, will go back and it'll say, hey, corpus luteum, we're here. And that corpus luteum will stay and it will not deteriorate. Okay, all right. So changes in hormone during pregnancy. Couple of things to look at here. First of all, this HCG, we mentioned that several times now, will go up, and then it kind of falls off after about the second trimester. So trimester is 3 months. So after about the second trimester, it kind of drops down a little bit. However, if you look here, this first line, this blue one here that I'm turning black, is progesterone, and what happens with progesterone is it increases and really starts to increase really the whole time, but it will level off towards the end of pregnancy. Okay, so that's what progesterone does. It increases, but then it starts to level off. And estrogen, it doesn't start increasing as much, but you can see that what happens, something very interesting happens, is that the release of estrogen towards the end will actually, I don't know, I should erase this, and you can kind of see where it spikes a little bit, and the estrogen levels start to really increase and actually surpasses the progesterone. And this is kind of a trigger saying that, okay, we are at the end of the pregnancy, and that's going to then lead to a series of events, including oxytocin being released from the posterior pituitary, and then contractions, dilation of the cervix, and birth will then take place. Parturition will take place. Okay, so during that time, the mammary glands were also developing in the breasts. Okay, so these are organs of milk production. And you can see here there are these things called alveoli, and these will start to proliferate, and they grow in size, they grow in number, and they have within them they have cells that are specialized for milk production. Okay, so the breasts become ready, and they are able to produce milk as soon as the baby's born. Okay, and so just like in the placenta, we didn't really talk about it, but in the placenta, all of these nutrients that we're moving across, like oxygen, glucose, fat, one of the other things that moves across are antibodies. Okay, so that can move across in the placenta, so the baby's born with some immunity, but also the breast milk will also have some antibodies that can then that when the baby suckles, when the baby feeds from it, can also be given to the baby. Okay, so oxytocin. Okay, so that was what triggered birth to begin with, but that will also trigger throughout after pregnancy. Will trigger what's called the letdown reflex. And so normally these canals that are in here do not allow the milk to pass very easily. Okay, but oxytocin will kind of cause those to dilate a little bit, and that will allow the milk that's being produced to move out through the nipple for the baby, sometimes even without the baby suckling. Once this letdown reflex starts to happen, then milk will actually start to move out. Of course, it's better if the baby is suckling, but that's not always the case. Now, another thing that happens is you make something called prolactin. Okay, so prolactin's made by the hypothalamus, and that's what actually triggers the production of milk. So that will actually activate these cells so that they start producing milk, and that will then that milk is there, it's produced, it's ready, and then when the baby starts to suckle, that milk the letdown reflex will then allow that milk to move out. Okay, so lactation, control of milk secretion. Well, before birth, nothing's happening. Well, I mean, development is happening, but there's something called prolactin inhibiting hormone that prevents mom from making a lot of milk. Okay, so there's a hormone that's blocking prolactin secretion, and but then remember, so we had estrogen that increased and progesterone that increased. After birth, both of these hormone levels drop. Okay, so they drop considerably. And so during when they're very high, that's what's actually triggering this prolactin inhibiting hormone. Okay, this high levels of estrogen, progesterone, and but after birth, these hormone levels, especially we're talking about estrogen, will drop, and then that will allow lactation to take place. So high prolactin, so the prolactin levels will increase, and the fact that there is low estrogen will lead to lactation. Okay. And so that's allowing the milk to be made. So the breast milk, as I mentioned earlier, has nutrients and offers some immunity to whatever's out there. Suckling, so the baby latching on, or sometimes even getting close, or even thinking about it sometimes. But that will inhibit the prolactin inhibiting hormone, and that allows milk production. Prolactin is leading to this milk production. Oxytocin, see, oxytocin is part of this letdown reflex. So there's the breast. It's making the milk. It has milk production going on, but it's not being allowed out. And so oxytocin, and a lot of times oxytocin, it doesn't even take suckling for this to happen. Suckling will lead to that, but sometimes it's just the baby crying, or it could even not even be your baby. It could be somebody else's baby. I mean, this happens to women who are lactating. They might hear another baby crying. They could even think about it, and it will cause this release of oxytocin, which triggers this letdown reflex, and then the milk can start to move out of the breast. Okay, so which makes it easier for the baby to nurse. Okay, so that's it for those things that we're talking about. Now I want to go back and talk about hormonal contraception, because hormonal contraception is something that affects many, many, many of us, okay? Males and females, even though females are the ones that usually take these contraceptives, they also obviously affect males. So if we can remember this idea of negative feedback. Okay, negative feedback. That means that when estrogen and progesterone are being made, up to a point, it will keep the luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone levels low. Okay, so remember, when estrogen levels really get high towards the end of that follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, remember when they get high, then suddenly the estrogen will cause the surge of LH. But when they're just marginally high, so if we have a graph here, So if as long as they aren't really high like up here, if they're just kept marginally high, then what happens is the FSH and LH are very low. So there's very low production of those. And so what for the most part what hormonal contraceptives do is they keep the hormone levels normal. Okay, they keep them from not fluctuating, not changing very much, because they're controlling this LH and this FSH. Okay, and the GnRH as well. Okay, so the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is in the hypothalamus, that was kind of driving the whole thing. Okay, so essentially there are two main types of hormonal birth control. There's combined estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and now we also have progesterone only pills. Okay, so we're going to talk about how each of these work. Both are over 98% effective when taken properly, and that's the big key. They have to be taken properly. Um, Okay, to be that effective. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the combined. So estrogen. So when we talk about combined, we're talking about estrogen and progestin. Okay, not progesterone, progestin. Progestin is synthetic. Okay, so that's made by humans. So progestin is a synthetic progesterone, and there's an important thing about progestin and the fact that it's synthetic and it's not progesterone that we're going to talk about. But these suppress this LH and FSH that are released from the anterior pituitary. So they suppress these. They keep them pretty low. Okay? So if you keep LH especially low, that means there's not going to be an LH surge. No LH surge as long as you're keeping these hormones, estrogen, progesterone in there. No LH surge. If there's no LH surge, that means no ovulation. Okay, so that question comes up a lot. People ask, okay, well, when you're on the pill, do you still ovulate? No. Okay, so that's one of the points is no ovulation. Um, so now I mentioned earlier that progestin was synthetic. Remember progesterone, and we have to know this for this class, for the test, whatever. But we know that progesterone actually causes the endometrium to it strengthens it. It causes it to proliferate and become secretory. Progestin, and this is why this matters, the synthetic version actually thins the endometrium. Okay, so now we have no ovulation, but just in case there is ovulation, now we have a really thin endometrium, okay, because of this progestin. So the endometrium is thin, so that means even if an egg does get fertilized, it's not going to be able, so chances are it's going to have less of a chance of actually implanting in the uterus because of this thinner endometrium. And that's because this progestin doesn't work exactly the same way as progesterone, but it gets in the way. Okay, so it gets in the way of the natural progesterone that will actually build it up, and so it actually causes the endometrium to thin. Okay, um, so menstruation so even with the combined oral contraceptions, you can prevent menstruation by taking a continuous dose. However, that's usually not the way it happens. Usually there is the what you call sugar pills, but they don't contain any hormones. And so here you have this constant hormone production here, or not production, but you're giving the hormone constantly, and of course you're taking it every day, so it's going up and down, but overall it prevents the LH and the FSH from surging, especially the LH. But then you stop that, and these hormone levels drop, and when they drop, that will trigger menses, so that will trigger the sloughing off of the endometrial lining, menstruation. Okay. And so here are a couple of graphs. You can see the one where you have the spikes. That's the oral contraception. That's the one that you take and once a day or something. And then we have, let's see, there's the patch. Okay, so the patch is going to make it a little more constant. The Nuva ring, which is inserted into the vagina, and that keeps it fairly constant, but still elevated. Okay, and that's what you need. Is you need it to be elevated, and so that's going to prevent that LH. It keeps the LH and the FSH pretty low. Okay, so that was the combined. Now there's also the progestin only. Now, I skipped something on the other page, but it's also right here. So progestin only. Progestin is synthetic form of progesterone. All pills, generally, when you take the progestin only, you're taking all pills. So that means you may not have you may not have menses, you may not menstruate or bleed at all. So it can be taken every day, or it can be injected. So with time release, they've developed a formula for time release. Um, and the primary mechanism, and this is kind of interesting, is remember when we talked about progesterone and how it caused thickening of the cervical mucus. Okay, the cervix of the uterus right here, this neck area. So here's the vagina. It causes, so progestin does do that, and it prevents sperm from being able to enter. Okay, that's fantastic. You prevent the sperm from entering, and then you can't get pregnant from that. Um, so depending on the dose, now there are some very low doses that will allow ovulation to take place sometimes, but in general, it prevents ovulation. And again, we already mentioned this. It thins the endometrium. Okay, and that's because of this synthetic form. Okay, so the synthetic form thins the endometrium, so even if a sperm does get through, and even if ovulation does take place, it's less likely to implant. So you have a lot of things going on that are preventing actual, first of all, preventing the sperm from getting there, and then if there is fertile, and then if it does get there, chances are there's not going to be an oocyte there, and if there is, chances are it's not going to be able to implant. So as long as you take this properly, that's why they work so well. Okay, so what about male contraception? Well, they've tried male hormone pills because testosterone works the same way. Remember, luteinizing hormone was activating those Leydig cells, and then the Leydig cells were producing the testosterone. Well, the testosterone has the same type of negative feedback. It stops the production of luteinizing hormone. Okay, and it stops the production of follicle stimulating hormone, which without those things, you can't produce sperm. Okay, so they've tried this. Administering testosterone will also decrease LH and FSH through negative feedback, preventing sperm production. It's not effective for all men, and there have been behavioral side effects. Well, behavioral side effects, hormonal effects in men. Lord knows we don't need more testosterone in the world, but there are behavioral effects from the hormonal changes in men, which there are hormonal effects for women too, but I I don't know why, but that seems, I don't know. That's either been accepted, or maybe a lot of times actually the hormonal, it keeps the hormonal levels more constant in women. So maybe that's why it's okay. Um, let's see. However, mixing testosterone with progestin appears to be more effective, but then you're asking men to take progestin, which is going to cause that negative feedback, um, and for whatever reason that doesn't take place either. So a lot of the trials have been ended early, and even though there is this possibility, and there are certain places, I think different areas of the world, these are actually being used and tested in the general population, but it hasn't really taken a hold here. So the goal is to get sperm production to less than 100 million sperm per milliliter. That sounds like a whole lot of sperm, but it takes a whole lot more than that for a pregnancy to occur. So we can look at this, and if we say it's less than 100 million sperm per milliliter, that's going to be a very low chance of fertilization to take place. Okay, well that's it for this section. Actually, that's it for everything in this entire chapter.